and and everybody who will be here. My name is Josh Freeman, and I've been asked to moderate this session, and it's a great honor. This is, I can't remember which 7 or 8 of the Socialist Perspectives in Health, 7, in our Socialist Perspectives in Health series, sponsored by the Socialist Caucus of APHA, SCAPHA. And it promises to be as good as all the previous ones. It's very exciting to me that today we will have an old friend and mentor of mine, Seiji Yamada from the University of Hawaiʻi, be the speaker on some issues that are very important, clearly part of our socialist health agenda, and yet not talked about often enough, especially on the mainland. So I look forward to hearing it. Let me just introduce Dr. Yamada. Seiji Yamada was born in Hiroshima and raised in Naperville, Illinois. He obtained his MD from the University of Illinois at Chicago and completed his family medicine residency at Cook County Hospital, which is where I knew him from, and obtained his MPH from the University of Hawaiʻi. His first post-residency job was in Saipan in the Northern Marianas Islands, and he's currently a professor in the University of Hawaiʻi, Department of Family Medicine and Community Health. He opposes the military occupation of Ka Pae Aina, Hawaii, which I don't know if I pronounced that right, and advocates for human rights in the Philippines. And he writes frequently for Counterpunch, at counterpunch.org. So Dr. Yamada.
Thank you so much. So let me share my screen. Maximize it. Minimize myself. Okay. So hope folks don't mind. I've retitled this Looking Upstream, the Pacific Islands Sacrifice Zone. Please let me know if I'm not speaking loudly enough. I'd like to acknowledge that I am a settler colonialist speaking to you from Ka Pae Aina, Nui, commonly called Hawaii, the homeland of the Kanaka Maoli people. And as Dr. Kekuni Blaisdell taught us, as our ancestors, we consider Ka Nui, all of Oceania, to be our ancestral homeland, to bind us, not separate us, as our US colonizer insists. Paul Farmer asks, do the poor come into view when they become research subjects, or is the next step the inclusion of everyone under the rubric everybody? He asks, should we include all humans under the rubric human? Should we include social and economic rights under the rubric of human rights? Howard Waitskin points out that, well, obviously all of us have heard the upstream analogy, and that John Stokel may have been the first to come up with it. Howard writes about it in AJPH. So I call this the sacrifice zone of the Pacific because in Hedges and Sacco's book, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, they go and visit a number of what they call sacrifice zones in the US, including the coal mining country of West Virginia, the Pine Ridge Reservation in North Dakota, and Camden, New Jersey. So borrowing a phrase from Paul Farmer, we're going to try to take a historically deep and geographically broad view of this. Before his untimely death, Paul gave us his last book, Fevers, Hues, and Diamonds, examining Ebola and the ravages of history, mostly in Western Africa. And when he came to talk to us remotely in February, really just a week before he passed away, he suggested that social medicine is the most expansive rubric that we have. So I am going to talk about some health issues, including tuberculosis and diabetes, but I'm going to actually try to draw some causal inferences to intermediate causes back to industrial capitalism, climate change, and militarism. So nuclear testing took place in the Marshall Islands in 1946 to 1957, and 67 of the US's most powerful devices were tested in the Marshall Islands. All of the thermonuclear devices were tested in the Marshall Islands. The most notorious of these was the Castle Bravo test of March 1st, 1954, which deposited radioactive fallout over inhabited atolls of the Northern Marshall Islands. Now, you look at this date here, March 1st, 1954, in the planning documents from the previous fall, November 1953, it went through and planned a variety of projects, and of them, Project 4.1 was a study of the response of human beings exposed to significant beta and gamma radiation due to fallout from high-yield weapons. Now, of course, the US government has claimed ever since that it was accidental that the Marshallese people were exposed to radiation, but it seems to have been quite thoroughly planned. And within days of the test, the US Navy radiobiology team, radiobiology physicians, gathered to study the Marshallese. Here you see thyroid being examined, because thyroid cancer is one of the most common consequences of radiation exposure. And you can see here in the photos that they took of the subjects, or shall we say survivors or victims, that Project 4.1 was quite clearly identified as the originating project. The Marshallese have had to move here and there and outside of the US, I'm sorry, and outside of the Marshall Islands ever since. So one of the islands is used as a test site for the ballistic missile defense system. The idea of somebody in the area of, well, it kind of looks somewhere like China or maybe North Korea, shoots a intercontinental ballistic missile at the US, then the US will send up an interceptor missile to hit a bullet with a bullet in space. And we here in Hawaii are familiar with this golf ball that sits in Pearl Harbor. It's part of the ballistic missile defense system at a cost of $8 billion a year. It actually has such a narrow field of vision. Supposedly, you can see a baseball from across the continent, but it has such a narrow field of vision that it's hard to actually track anything. In the end, the ballistic missile defense system, as with much of our armaments corporations, is a trough that the armaments corporations feed at. You can see the major corporations involved in the ballistic missile defense system. And you know, when I'm in the market for a extra atmospheric kill vehicle, I always look for that Raytheon label. So these are the Marshall Islands. This is Majuro Atoll, the capital island, the major population center. And the second population center is Kwajalein Atoll, and particularly this southeast tip of the Kwajalein Atoll, the largest atoll in the world in terms of area, very low-lying islands. And the southern tip is where Kwajalein Island is and Ibai Island is. This is Kwajalein Island. And so while the US might complain about about China building up bases in the South China Sea or the West Philippine Sea, much of this island was built up by dredging from the nearby coral reef. You can see it's mainly taken up by a large airstrip with a golf, of course, next to it. The population of Kwajalein Island ranges between 2,000 to 4,000 non-Marshallese, and mostly they are employees of US contractors, including actual rocket scientists. This, I believe, is, I think you weren't supposed to take these pictures, but I did. But I think this is the prototype for the golf ball that sits in Pearl Harbor some of the time. It's actually supposed to be up near Alaska, actually. There's wide open spaces on Kwajalein. There are a couple of pools, a saltwater and a freshwater. When we first started visiting, this was the Officers Eating Club, free movies at nighttime, and a large playground, curiously bereft of any children. The groceries are stocked with fresh produce, and given that there's Foremost milk there, obviously flown in from Hawaii. Meanwhile, life on Ibai Island, there's 10 to 15,000 Marshallese living there. The Marshallese actually work on Kwajalein Island, where they perform the manual labor. They arrive in the morning and must return to Ibai in the evening. They've replaced this launch, but this is actually a World War II era landing craft of the kind that were used to, say, land on Iwo Jima or Saipan or places like that. And the Marshallese would take this 3-mile ferry ride back and forth between Ibai and Kwajalein. When you arrive, there's pretty tight security. It's actually more tight than this season. Now here is life back on Ibai Island. You can see that the construction is quite flimsy, a lot of plywood and corrugated iron roofing. There's very little green space. The entire island is really just sort of paved or covered with this crushed coral rock. Children don't have any place to play besides on the streets. Here's some boys and some girls playing on the street. Electricity goes out for long periods, and so people stock up on non-perishable food. And so here is corned beef and corned beef from New Zealand, I believe. So what you have is the displacement of people to a place like Ibai by weapons testing. It diminishes their ability to produce staples such as taro and breadfruit. People become dependent on white rice, for which we can blame Japanese colonialism. Canned meat such as Spam and corned beef, Marlboros and Bud and Bud Light, which obviously lead to increases in obesity and diabetes.
Right here.
Our friends in TB control suggest that diabetes is a big cause of the tuberculosis in the Pacific. And so weapons testing leads to diabetes, leads to tuberculosis. Now, the whole point of this, of course, is the militarization of the Pacific. Currently, the thrust is the coming war with China. This is the USS George Washington carrier group. And I suggest here that the Hawaii is also a sacrifice zone. What's going on now in Hawaii is that there is a Red Hill bulk fuel storage facility, which is a complex of 20 underground tanks constructed in the 1940s, located only 100 feet above the major aquifer for the entire island of Oahu. Here's a diagram. It's located near Pearl Harbor, so used for fueling ships in Pearl Harbor and aircraft at Hickam Air Base. And these are the, oops, guess I can't really use the pointer there. Okay, those cylindrical things are, well, each of them is so large that Aloha Towers can sit within each one. Quite massive structures carved out of basalt rock in the 1940s, starting during World War II, and it was actually a secret until apparently 1990s they existed at all.
Year beginning of the pandemic, and I got some New Balance, not trail running shoes though. But I think they're still good because I don't use I only use my shoes for running. I don't ever wear them for anything else.
Hi, Alexandros, you're interrupting the talk.
Sorry, is somebody asking a question?
I know Dennis.
I think the host can mute.
I wasn't able to come inside, so it was all outside.
Sorry if you're not asking a question, if I could ask you to mute. Okay, so each of these 20 tanks holds 12.5 million gallons of fuel, and there's 20 of them, so it adds up to 250 million gallons of fuel. So in November of 2021, the Navy water system, which serves over 90,000 military personnel, but also civilians, around Thanksgiving, folks started noticing that their fuel the water from their tap began to smell like fuel, and they developed a variety of health complaints, and many people ended up in the hospital, in the emergency departments, and obviously coming from the Red Hill facility, the governor of Hawaii ordered the Navy to shut down its Red Hill facility, and the Navy initially refused to comply. There was a movement of people in Hawaii against this action by the Navy, and finally, and even the conventional politicians eventually came along for the ride, despite their having stonewalled the issue for a decade prior to this. Finally, in March, the Secretary of Defense agreed that the Navy would be shutting down the Red Hill facility, and a few weeks afterwards, or actually just last week, the Navy released a report from a contractor that noted that pipes and valves were corroded and deteriorated. There was an incident that risked a major fire, and a near miss incident that could have led to deaths of workers there. And then all of these problems will require major repairs, and then maybe the tanks defueling would take a year. So more stonewalling by the U.S. military. So my friend Dr. Kalama Oka Aina Niheu, who I believe has joined us on this call, notes that the historical trauma and the continuing displacement of Native peoples from their lands in this talk. Please take a listen if you have a chance. It'll be in my references. Actually, maybe not in the references. Maybe you can get it from this slide. Okay, so I told you at the beginning that this is what I was going to talk about, and so hopefully I've kind of laid out the case for you in what way health problems arise from the weapons testing, the militarism leading back to industrial capitalism. But we also have the fact that in the Marshall Islands, the average height above sea level of the islands is 2 meters or 6 feet. And this is a Star Bulletin article from 2007. So folks in the islands have known for a while that they're in trouble. During the lead up to the Paris Conference of Parties in 2015, there was some media focus on the Marshall Islands in particular. This is what it looks like when there's a king tide. And so what happens with king tides and things of this nature is that so it's not just an inch by inch rise of the sea level. It's that many atoll islands get flooded annually. And so you salinize the limited freshwater resources. And if you flood a taro patch, you can't grow taro there for a good 5 years of no inundation. And so the scholar of Micronesia, Father Francis Hazel, suggests that perhaps the larger issue is whether life in the remote atoll remains viable in today's world. And he said this back in 2009. So I've kind of switched out weapons development for climate change. And so climate change also leads to displacement of people to population centers such as Ibai, where people are dependent completely on imports of white rice, canned meats, tobacco, etc., leading to the same consequences of obesity and diabetes, crowding, poor access to healthcare, and tuberculosis. So for a while, the yeah, here we go. So you can see here that the case rate or incidence in the Marshall Islands is astoundingly many times that of the U.S. proper. For a while, the WHO used to calculate this in terms of prevalence. So meaning 1 in 200 people are walking around with active tuberculosis in the Marshall Islands as of 2014. And switching gears here a little bit to another group of islands in the Pacific, those of Chuuk. There was a MDR-TB outbreak there in July of 2008, or in 2008. This is my friend Dick Brostrom. He's actually really tall. He's not standing on something, but he took on the combating multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, and as the caption says here, effective second-line drugs were not obtained for more than 1 year after the first case was identified, resulting in a number of secondary cases, specifically a bunch of children. So the folks at the CDC figured out that the genetic fingerprint of this multi-drug resistant TB came from a strain that was found in China, but actually came to the Chuk via a man who worked at one of these garment factories in Saipan. So Saipan, it's kind of gone now, but had an active garment factory industry where they was kind of scour the third world and hire people at very low wages to do piecemeal work, labor no-no, inside the factories. And you can see these high gates, many of them walled compounds with barbed wire on top. These workers were actually locked in their factories except for maybe, I think, Saturday afternoons. Okay, switching back to the Marshall Islands. The Marshallese are leaving the Marshall Islands in droves, and because of the compacts of free association, Marshallese are allowed to settle in the U.S. Continent, and so as well as Hawaii, and so a lot of folks are actually in Northwest Arkansas. Now, why Northwest Arkansas? Well, Northwest Arkansas is a bit of a boom town. So Walmart has its international headquarters there. The largest trucking company in North America, JB Hunt, that's JB with his cowboy hat, is located in Northwest Arkansas. And most of the Marshallese actually end up working in chicken factories, so chicken processing plants. Naomi Klein asks, when she visited us in 2015, asked, well, what about say like the TV set in your living room that you bought at the big box store? Well, so most likely that was manufactured in either Mexico or China. China using coal-fired power plants, and shipped transcontinentally across the Pacific, and ends up in Los Angeles port, from where it's shipped to your neighborhood big box store. Now, the manufacturing is attributed to China. The shipping in the U.S. is, attributed to the U.S. Nobody takes any credit for that transoceanic shipping carbon footprint. My friend Caleb Klipowitz studied the tuberculosis in particular in the Marshallese workers in Northwest Arkansas, and found that they often developed TB 1 or 2 years after arrival. They worked in crowded conditions. Of course, there's also been high mortality secondary to COVID among the poultry processing workers, and many complex cases of extrapulmonary TB. So Richard Lewontin, the evolutionary biologist, suggested, although one may say that the tubercle bacillus causes tuberculosis, we are much closer to the truth when we say that it was the conditions of unregulated 19th century competitive capitalism that was the cause of tuberculosis. but social causes are not in the ambit of biological science. So medical students at the John A. Burns School of Medicine, University of Hawaiʻi, John A. Burns School of Medicine, continue to be taught that the cause of tuberculosis is a bacillus. This book about the White Plague, Industrial Revolution, starting in Britain, and then, yeah, kind of going around the world to places like garment factories in Saipan. Johann Galtung suggested in 1969 that violence is here defined as a cause of the difference between the potential and the actual. If a person died from tuberculosis in the 18th century, it would be hard to conceive of this as violence. But if he dies from it today, despite all the medical resources in the world, then violence is present. So hopefully I've kind of filled out this graphic for you. And of course, I'm sure that we all recognize what is meant when we say that the handle of the Broad Street pump is industrial capitalism. So what do we do about TB in the Marshall Islands? Well, again, my friend Dick Brostrom came up with the idea that, well, basically we should treat people with active TB. We should actually go and screen the whole population and find them and treatment, because one good thing about TB is that control from a public health point of view turns on treating people who have TB. This is a effort in EBI in 2017, led by Dick. So in conclusion, many of the vulnerable to the downstream effects of climate change live in sacrifice zones, largely out of sight and out of mind. The inhabitants of sacrifice zones are essentially not included under the rubric of human. And while industrial capitalism is a handle of the Broad Street pump, climate refugees, meaning Marshallese working in chicken processing in Northwest Arkansas, are now helping to pump it. Essentially, we're unlikely to be rid of industrial capitalism soon. People displaced by climate change will demonstrate morbidity patterns reflective of their home jurisdiction. So yeah, if you have tuberculosis in Marshall Islands and it's not treated, you're likely to have it in Northwest Arkansas also. And control of TB depends on usual TB control methods. So we can't like wait around waiting to reverse climate change. The human rights of climate refugees must be protected, including the human right to health. So some further reading and watching. And a coda here. So this is from a piece that Arcelita and Gregory and I wrote a few years ago. It's published in Social Medicine, and we suggest that why we need revolutionary medicine now, because of things such as climate catastrophe, threats of nuclear war, which Noam Chomsky calls two major threats to the survival of our species. We've added this grotesque inequalities that we observe also. And we write, our planet has crossed a tipping point at which the greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere will affect the climate for the remainder of the Anthropocene age, thousands of years from now. Will it still be called the Anthropocene after human civilization has collapsed? the time scale for that collapse draws even closer, with some predicting that it may actually occur before 2050. And finally, David Graeber, in one of his earlier books, Fragments of an Anarchist Anthropology, in 2004, suggests we should no longer think of the coming revolution in terms of storming the Bastille or a Leninist seizure of power. Rather, we should look to hundreds of activists in fairy suits tickling police with feather dusters. So kind of foreshadowing Occupy, David Graeber, who unfortunately left us at the age of 59. Hollow, if I can provide anybody with any resources, anybody would like to chat about these issues, please contact me at seiji@hawaii.edu. So thanks very much. I'm going to stop sharing.
So thank you very much, Seiji. I thought that was terrific. I've heard you and others speak about some of these issues, but bringing it all together like that was very cogent, in my opinion. We have a good bit of time left for questions. So how should we handle the questions, Ken? Should we have people ask them in the chat, or just put their write stack in the chat, and then we'll call on people in the order that they appear, which is—
Yeah, I think stack is a good idea.
Okay, so just go to everyone, write stack if you have a question, and then I'll call on you and you'll ask it. You don't even have to write out your question. Well, I guess I'll just start to kick us off. Seiji, you talked about, right now, I suppose, it makes sense that if you have tuberculosis from the Marshall Islands and you migrate to the continental United States, say to Bentonville, Arkansas, you will still have tuberculosis. But what happens in future generations? How long does this persist? Will we continue to see ongoing migration from the Marshall Islands and the other Pacific Islands to the United States, or do we think it will stop? What's the prognosis for what happens to Pacific Island people?
Well, I think there's the push factor of climate change, but there's also factors such as folks wanting to have a better education for their children, better jobs, more job opportunities, as well as healthcare, proper healthcare. And so there's all these push and pull factors for migration from places like the Marshall Islands. And then on top of that, there's the fact that if without building up the Marshall Islands significantly, it's going to be underwater soon. And you know, as Father Hazel said, life is going to be unsustainable. And so it's definitely going to come to a point where there's going to be a crisis. Now, the U.S. is to some extent not willing to completely abandon the Northern Pacific, where the Micronesian islands are, because of their strategic importance. The Marshall Islands specifically have been encouraged to be friends with Taiwan, and as have the other U.S. associated Pacific Islands, and basically denying the Northern Pacific Islands to China in this great powers conflict that we are now embroiled in.
All right, let's get to our next question. Sasha Adkins, if you unmute yourself, please go ahead.
Thank you all, first of all, for this talk. This is really powerful. I teach global health, and I'm trying to figure out how do I talk about these connections in ways that won't further the agenda of xenophobia, of stigmatizing these migrants who come and may have, let's say, active tuberculosis. You know, this is the excuse that's being used on the southern border with COVID. So how do we say, yes, this is a problem, and what's necessary is erase the conditions that led to the TB outbreak in the first place and treat folks without saying, oh, we have to be careful of letting migrants in because they might be bringing these pathogens. How do you teach that?
Well, I find, thank you for your question. I found it most useful to work side by side with my friend Sheldon Ricklin, Marshallese family physician, in that he kept me honest to use inclusive language to try to be an ally. So I think as for myself here in Hawaii, there's quite a bit of racism actually towards Micronesians, and not only Marshallese but Chukis who are even more recent migrants to Hawaii, and so I as much as I can try to be an ally, and so there was actually denial of participation in Medicaid, called MedQuest here in Hawaii, for nearly maybe over a decade, and and I have taken part in the sort of community and legal battle to get Medicaid restored for Micronesian folks. So I guess my answer is in the end, we want to be academics. We want to use the correct language to describe things, but I think we also want to be activists and allies, and have our work used in ways that further the cause of health and anti-racism.
Thank you.
All right, Ken Rosenberg, you're up next.
So my question, Seiji, is a number of us have been reading and talking and thinking about how climate change causes climate refugees, with most of the emphasis being on Syria and the Middle East. But it seems like this is very much a parallel situation, and that it might be useful for Micronesians and for Hawaiians to sort of grapple with, yeah, this is a worldwide phenomenon. Yes, this is happening. In some places it's happening because it's gotten too dry. In other places it's happening because there's no food and people have to move. In some cases it's happening because the sea is rising. And that perhaps broadening people's vision of where does all this fit in the near future of the world might be helpful.
Yeah, so one thing I found interesting was that the Marshallese statesman that was most prominent in anti-nuclear activities, Tony DeBruym, who has since passed away. So when all of his international efforts to say ban, get nuclear weapons bans and such, was never supported by the U.S. Whereas, like in 2015, when at the Paris climate accords. The Obama administration actually sort of trotted out Tony DeBruym to the international audience as the aspirational goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius in global warming was suggested. We're actually, I think, already quite close to that by this time. So yeah, so in the end, you know, the Marshallese are and I hope Sheldon wouldn't mind me saying the Marshallese are sort of like a canary in a coal mine, to mix metaphors a bit, and to see their plight, and to for us at least in the Pacific Islands region, to recognize how climate change is affecting Marshallese in the ways that I've suggested here. I think should be an impetus for all of us to kind of keep our eyes on the prize of combating the climate crisis and the climate catastrophe that's really starting to happen already.
All right, Doris Siegel Matsunaga, you're next. You've written your question down, but you can present it orally, and look forward to hearing it.
Aloha, Seiji, and everyone else. Long time no see, Seiji.
Good to see you, Doris.
Yeah, thank you for this presentation. I have a more sort of specific, not the broader issues, but I was just wondering what you know or have heard about the impact of COVID on COFA migrants working in Arkansas, and especially in the meat packing plants.
Yeah, I think early on in 2020, during the COVID pandemic, the morbidity and mortality rates among the Marshallese in Arkansas as a state were astoundingly high compared to the general population of Arkansas. And obviously this related to not only work in crowded areas like in the meatpacking plants, which were affected kind of nationwide, but also the fact that people are still actually, you know, they're working, but they're poor, and there will often be a large household living in a single dwelling or apartment. And so I think we also saw some of that here in Hawaii among the Pacific, the greater rates of COVID infection and death among Pacific Islanders compared to the rest of the population here in Hawaii. So yeah, it was I think quite a tragedy for the Marshallese in Northwest Arkansas. Yeah, I guess one other factor has been the comorbidities. So look, you know, comorbidities such as obesity and diabetes, which obviously we know lead to more severe COVID infection and death. So much more prevalent among the Pacific Islanders. So I agree with the editor of the Lancet, Richard Horton, when he says we should look at COVID-19 as a syndemic. We can see in what ways that it has most severely affected the people that were already poor, that were already having epidemics of non-communicable diseases, diabetes and cardiovascular disease. So Horton is suggesting now, it's not simply a matter of focusing on that microorganism, which I think we're starting to see even in sort of global health circles, as Bill Gates criticizes the WHO for not having it together. So this sort of technical fix of getting the microorganism under control. It's not simply that. It's I think best looked at as a syndemic.
Thank you, Seiji.
So that's the last question we have signed up for in the chat. We do have a couple more minutes. If anybody who's been sitting back and thinks they have a question but wasn't sure if they were going to ask it, wants to now, this would be a good time to raise your hand or put something in the chat and ask Dr. Yamada. Or if you have a comment on what he had to say, go for it. Ken.
So, Seiji, I'm not clear about the legal status of Micronesians in the United States. Is there a situation similar to Puerto Ricans in that they have citizenship and can move around? Do they have citizenship? Are they eligible for citizenship?
So the Compacts of Free Association give folks from the Republic of Palau, the Federated States of Micronesia, which includes Chuuk, and the Republic of the Marshall Islands, free entry into the U.S. And the right to work. They are not citizens. They carry passports from their respective so-called nations. So-called nations in the sense that they have a seat in the General Assembly, and sometimes on controversial subjects such as Israel, it'll be FSM and Marshall Islands voting together with the U.S. and Israel. So that's their status. They're actually not immigrants. They don't actually come through the U.S. Customs and Immigration, and so they're actually migrants.
But their children are eligible for citizenship if they're born here.
That's correct. If you're born in the U.S., you're eligible for citizenship.
And Micronesia was historically part of the Japanese Empire, or was it historically independent?
Much of Micronesia was well, some of Micronesia, such as Guam and Saipan, were initially colonized by the Spanish. The first to arrive and then the Germans came in like the late 1800s. The Japanese took over the German Pacific Empire after World War II. So much of Micronesia was Japanese colonies between World War I and World War II, but was obviously wrested from Japan, Imperial Japan, by the sort of island hopping campaign of World War II.
All right, I'm going to mispronounce this. Ka Pae Aina, you had a statement in the chat. Would you like to direct it to all of us verbally, or just let us read it?
Hi, Seiji. Thanks for inviting me to this presentation. I just wanted to, one of the things that you had brought up earlier was that there's you hear about a lot in the climate change affecting the Syria and the Middle East. But I think what is really important for us to, part of how we can make these connections is that the climate refugees happening in Central and South America are a big part of that's causing a lot of challenges with immigration, and as well as people losing the ability to do basic farming. It's also affecting Asia, Pacific Islands. It's really a global issue now. We're starting to see it happen in the first world as well. So I think one of the ways that we have to bring this concern in is when we're looking at creating global unity, is understanding is that the United States military is the single largest utilizer of fossil fuels. And so looking at not just, having violence in our own homes, but also having violence being coming home to roost. And it's not at a certain point, there's going to be a point where there's no refuge. We're all going to be in significant and dire straits if we don't work together to try and resolve a lot of this injustice. You just can't have this layering of injustice and justice forever.
Agree 100% with Kalama, and I would say that this as Howard Weizmann suggests, I think the U.S. economy is based on weapons production, war and weapons production, and the casino of financialization of everything, housing debt, student debt, etc. And so, we obviously have to put our economies on a completely different footing, lest we end up like the children of Uvalde. And so here in the Pacific, I think we have to work more closely together to oppose war and militarism. Biden has come out and said now there's a red line that if China were to try to take Taiwan, that the U.S. is going to get involved militarily, and so we can see year to year that there's this up towards this coming war with China, the tremendous waste of resources. But of course, who's happy about it? Armaments manufacturers and the petroleum corporations. They're laughing all the way to the bank as the Biden administration escalates the war in the Ukraine against the Russia and China. So we have I think we have to work on finding people-to-people ways of getting together and making friendships across the continents, across the islands.
Thank you, Seiji. And thank you. Does anyone have any last questions before we wrap this up? Well, I'd just like to thank you all for coming. It was incredibly informative. And maybe some of us will be stimulated to go ahead and try to do something now. I mean, we all do, but try to do even more. So thank you very much. And Ken, I'll leave it to you to close it up.
For those of you who are coming to the American Public Health Association annual meeting in Boston in November, I presume that there will be the usual Socialist Caucus meeting, probably on the Sunday at the beginning of the conference. You're all welcome. It is conceivable that there will be some kind of a hybrid link through Zoom also. I don't think that's been decided. But thank you all very much. And especially thank you to Seiji.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. Be well.
Thank you.
Seiji, I can't believe how little I know about the Pacific.
Are you stopping the recording?